I thought I'd give you a little bit of a break from history, but now I want to talk a little bit about the history of studying the brain. One of the first people to study the brain was Franz Joseph Gall, who was alive from 1758 to 1828. And his approach was called phrenology. And you can still find phrenology websites that examine the likely personality of individuals based on the shape of their skull. So basically, he studied the structure of the skull to determine a person's character and mental capacity. And if you had a character that wasn't very nice, that needed some remediation, you would be sent to someone to try to reduce the size of that part of your brain, or the size of that bump on your skull. And that's how psychiatrists came to be called head shrinks, because among phrenologists, their purpose was to shrink those undesirable lumps on your skull that were causing the problematic behavior. Now, many people went on to refine or expand his theory, but originally he had defined about 26 organs on the surface of the brain that were represented or showed themselves as bumps on the surface of the skull. Gall was a Viennese physician in the late 1700s and early 1800s who advocated for the use it or lose it school of thinking when it came to the brain. He thought that brain organs which were used a lot got bigger, and those that were not shrunk, causing the skull to rise and fall with organ development and the development of different personality characteristics. And these bumps and indentations, according to him, reflected specific areas of the brain that determined a person's emotional and intellectual functions. And the study of the brain in this way became known as phrenology. Phrenology was the study of the structure of the skull as it reflected a person's character, mental capacity, and personality. Gall's 26 organs were on the surface of the brain, and they included characteristics such as cautiousness, callousness, hope, immortality, self-esteem, time, and murder. Now, there was no scientific verification of any of this, but at the time, it was considered sophisticated and also a very fun parlor game to sort of figure out the shape of each other's head. Now, here's one example of the mapping of the surface of the skull. But if you were to Google phrenology, you would find all sorts of websites dedicated to this topic, showing its history, the original maps, helping you figure out what your personality is like based on the shape of your skull. A lot of people still actually practice this today. I'm not saying there's a scientific basis to it, however. Now, Florence, who lived from 1794 to 1867, also studied the brain, and he emphasized the importance of experimental research of the brain. So he conducted carefully controlled experiments on animals to determine the localities of the brain and their functions. And he helped move the field of brain research into a more scientific area. Now, at around this time, we didn't have human subjects committees, and there were some things that were performed on humans, sometimes opportunistically, that were probably considered pretty unethical. There was a young woman who had a barrette or something that had eroded part of her skull until the surface of the brain was visible. And while they had that visible, they did some experiments on that as well, which of course was dangerous due to the risk of infection. Basically, even throughout history, we've learned a lot about the brain, ethically and unethically, by accidents that happen to people. During the World Wars, people would keep careful records of the types of injuries people sustained and their location and the resulting behaviors to try to get a better sense of how different functions, behaviors, and controls were mapped out across the surface of the cerebral cortex. The way that Florin would study the brain was by surgically removing specific small parts of an animal's brain and observing any consequent changes in the behavior or function of the animal after recovery from the surgery. And we still use this technique today. He knew that brain tissue does not regenerate after removal, though there are exceptions of that today, especially now that we have certain therapeutic interventions that we can use. But at his time, there was no regeneration. And so he could attribute any change in the animal's behavior to being a direct result of removal of that part of the brain. He wasn't the first to approach brain research this way, but he refined it and made it much more specific and methodical. He was very careful in surgery to remove only the area of the brain that he was interested in, and carefully nursed all of his animals back to health before studying their behavior, thus increasing their chances of survival, of course, which he was interested in, so he could see the change in their behavior. And today, human substitutional review boards carefully oversee the nature of the research that's done on animals, so that even if people are doing damage to their brains, at least the animals are kept free from fear and pain during their participation in the research. One of the areas of research that Florens was curious about was Gall's theory. And so he went about testing some of Gall's beliefs in what parts of the brain are related to which behaviors. And Gall had thought that part of the cerebellum was responsible for sexual behavior, but Florens found that when he removed it, the animal was no longer to coordinate and regularize their movements, including their sexual movements, and therefore he was able to establish the cerebellum's role in controlling small muscle movements. Now this, and with his other research findings, helped to debunk the phrenology theory. But it still remains popular, and we still have websites that are dedicated to it. People have always been fascinated by the brain, and before they used the mummification process, the brain and other organs used to be removed from the body by ancient Egyptians, who believed, falsely, that the heart was the center of intelligence and thought. And so they got rid of the brain once it was removed from the body, thinking it was just sort of a useless organ. And the way they would do this is by using a special hooked instrument and putting it up the nose and pulling out bits of brain. This was done very delicately, as if disfiguring the face was to be avoided at all costs. A few thousand years later, doctors had figured out that the brain does have a wide variety of useful functions, but still they were very limited in their ability to learn about the brain without doing damage. So the main method that they had to study it was, again, to examine the brains of dead people, so that they... Okay. And here you have another graphic with the different areas of the brain identified. The most primitive area of the brain is the central core. This is the old brain, common to primitive animals, and it includes the brain stem, the first structure of which is the medulla. That's the first enlargement as the spinal cord enters the skull. The medulla controls breathing, blood circulation, heartbeat, and posture. And it's in the medulla that the different neurotracts carrying sensory impulses from each side of the body cross over. I don't know if you remembered this from the textbook, but the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the feelings from the left side of the body are experienced by the right side of the brain, and vice versa for the other side of the body and the other side of the brain. The next part is the pons. The pons means bridge. It's above the medulla, and it connects the two halves of the cerebellum above it. The pons transmits motor information and integrates movements between the left and right sides of the body. The other part of the central core is the midbrain, and it consists of the upper part of the stem. The midbrain is very important for visual and auditory reflexes, for instance, the startle reflex. Then there is the reticular formation, which is a network of neurons that extends up from the spinal cord to the thalamus and controls arousal and awareness, sleeping and waking. It's kind of our sensory system. It screens input, looking for danger, and it's very important for basic survival. It acts as a filter, allowing blocking of stimuli and selective attention, as well as sensory gating. If you've ever been alone in a house at night reading a book, you can tune out most normal house noises, but as soon as there's anything that resembles a creepy, unusual noise that could represent danger, it suddenly has your full attention, even though you've ignored absolutely every other noise in the house. It can also help you pick up that someone said your name in a crowded room of people. It's very good at picking up significant information and alerting you to it, sort of barking out to you to get your attention. Though it doesn't actually bark, of course. The cerebellum is the thing that looks like a little tiny brain at the back and base of our skull. It's above the medulla in the back of the head. And it regulates motor coordination and muscle tone. It is what helps us maintain balance, keeping our muscles tight enough to be in control, and is responsible for basic coordination. The actual movements, specific movements, have to be learned and are directed by higher centers, but just the basic coordination is done at the cerebellum level. If you have damage to this, it results in jerky, uncoordinated movements, or difficulty moving. The thalamus is the processing center of the cerebral cortex. What it does is it coordinates and regulates all the functional activity of the cortex via the integration of the afferent input to the cortex. In other words, the incoming neuron information to the cortex. Everything except for the sense of smell. And it also contributes to emotional expression. Now, if you have damage to the thalamus, the person will have altered levels of consciousness. They won't be alert and in tune with what's going on around them. And they may have a loss of some types of perception. There's also something called the thalamic syndrome, where you have unexplained spontaneous pain on the opposite side of the body from which the damage is done. The limbic system is sometimes called the nose brain because of its interactions with our sense of smell. It's located above the thalamus and below the cortex, and it's not found in animals below the phylogenetic scale. It overrides instinctual behavior, allows more flexible behavior, and without the limbic system, we would have to carry out activities in a very stereotypical manner. It plays a role in the 4 F's, feeding, sexual behavior, fleeing, and fighting, and includes the hippocampus, amygdala, and septal area. The hypothalamus is very important in motivating our behavior. It has to do with feeding behavior, it has to do with reproductive behavior, and also temperature maintenance. At the hypothalamus, you have the integration center of the autonomic nervous system, which regulates body temperature and endocrine functioning. In the anterior hypothalamus, you have the center for parasympathetic activity. That's the part of the hypothalamus that helps us maintain homeostasis, calm back down, relax, regenerate. In the posterior hypothalamus, you have all the sympathetic activity being initiated. That's the fight or flight and stress responses. So that's the part of the posterior hypothalamus is the part of the hypothalamus that's responsible for getting us going in cases of emergency. And it's also responsible for certain behavioral patterns, the physical expression of behavior. And as I mentioned, it's responsible for appetite. Our feeding center, damage to it can either make us eat too much or too little. And again, it's the pleasure, it's the center of all pleasure. All your rewards and drugs and sex all tap into this area for reinforcement. So it's the pleasure center of the brain. If you have damage to the hypothalamus, you're going to have problems with hormonal imbalances. You might have malignant hypothermia, in other words, problems with temperature maintenance. You'll have an inability to control temperature. You could have problems with diabetes. And also you can have neurogenic storms, some sort. The hippocampus is responsible for memory, especially short-term memory. it's responsible for not just holding things in short-term memory until they can be placed in long-term memory, but when you're trying to solve a problem that requires information from long-term memory to be pulled forward into your working memory, it's the hippocampus that does that. One of the classic cases is HM. When you have damage to this part of the brain, it's sort of like 50 First Dates, that movie. You don't remember what happened. In fact, it's worse than that, because you may not remember more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. So you can hear this same joke over and over again and think it's new and funny each time if you have severe damage to hippocampus. We had a student who had a milder version of that, and every day he had to be told how to get to class, where to go to class. He wouldn't remember anything, of course, and it was very sad. But sometimes in car accidents you see people who have had damage to this area. The amygdala is considered part of the limbic system and is important in feeding behavior, memory, and emotion, especially the memory for emotions. The brain has 2 halves and 4 lobes. The frontal lobe contains the motor cortex and has a lot of very important roles. It's key in cognition and memory, in other words, thinking and memory. The prefrontal area of the frontal lobe contains the ability to concentrate and pay attention, and also elaboration of thought, going into more detail. It's also the basis of personality and certain emotional traits. And again, it is responsible for voluntary movement through the motor cortex. And in the premotor cortex, there's storage of motor patterns and involuntary activities. In other words, little rituals that are involved in certain types of motions. And finally, the motor part of speech, in other words, how you form words, is remembered in the motor cortex. Now, if you have damage to the frontal lobe, it shows in a number of ways. There can be impairment of recent memory, inattentiveness, since the frontal lobe plays a role in controlling what you're paying attention to, inability to concentrate for the same reasons, certain behavioral disorders, especially problems with inhibition of behaviors, difficulty learning new information, and lack of inhibition in general, inappropriate social or sexual behavior. It also, because the frontal lobe plays a role in controlling or mediating an emotional responses, if there's damage to it, you may have episodes of emotional discontrol or rapid changes in mood or no mood. And there may be problems with remembering how to do really basic things because your memories for the motor movements involved in them have disappeared or been damaged. Finally, there can also be problems with planning. The frontal lobe is involved in long-term planning and problem solving, and if you have damage to the frontal lobe, you're going to have misjudgments in those areas, or you're not going to be able to follow through on your plans or organize them well. The parietal lobe is responsible for the processing of sensory input and sensory discrimination, telling the difference between different stimuli. It also plays a role in body orientation, where your body parts are, and your self-awareness in terms of your position, and primary and secondary somatic areas. In other words, more having to do with your sense of body image, body placement. If you have damage to the parietal lobe, you're going to be unable to discriminate between sensory stimuli. You might have trouble locating and recognizing parts of your own body. For instance, some people will walk into walls forgetting they have a right side. They just aren't aware of it because there's damage to this parietal lobe. You may even not be able to recognize yourself as being you if there's a very severe injury to the parietal lobe. And of course, as you might guess, a disorientation of environmental space, being very unable to position oneself and in the space that you are existing in a room, on a street, whatever, and the inability to write as well. The parietal lobe contains the sensory cortex, which is why when it's damaged, you have difficulty being aware of your limbs and where you are, because the information you're getting in from your limbs and your sensory receptors on your limbs is distorted. There's also the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is at the back of your head, towards the back of your head. Right. There's also the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is towards the side of your head, and it's responsible for receiving auditory information and associating unfamiliar and familiar noises. It also plays a role in express behavior and receptive speech, understanding what people are saying. And also with memory. It plays a key role in retrieving information from long-term memory. If you have damage to the temporal lobe, you are likely to have hearing problems and also be agitated, irritable, and childish, as well as have receptive and or sensory aphasia. In other words, people can be talking to you and you won't remember enough of language to be able to identify what they're saying. You're not going to be able to understand what is said to you. Finally, there's the occipital lobe, which contains visual areas. It is the main part of the brain associated with visual stimuli reception, and also allows for visual interpretation, interpreting the stimuli that are coming at you through your eyes and the optic nerve. If you have damage to the occipital lobe, you're going to have a loss of vision on the opposite side of the face. And you may also have a loss of the ability to recognize objects seen in the opposite field of vision, or may see flashes of lights or stars. Gall was the first person to identify the frontal lobes as centers for speech. Later on, Brocaw came along and started to study this phenomena. He found that disorders of speech related to the left frontal lobe damage, which was later named Brocaw's area. Damage to this area causes aphasia, slow, labored speech, and poor articulation. So people have trouble finding words and are slow to speak them and may not enunciate them terribly well. There's another area called Wernicke's area, and this area is concerned with language as well. It's located in the temporal lobe over the ear, and damage to this area results in a different type of aphasia. Sentences may be grammatically correct and speech may sound normal, but the sentences make no sense. And these findings led to a theory of language that says that language originates in Wernicke's area. Meaningful sentences are formed there. And then this information is transferred to Brocaw's area, which is responsible for programming the muscles involved in speech production. Therefore, damage to Brocaw's area affects speech, while damage to Wernicke's area affects meaningfulness. Now, the brain structure is interesting. We have the two hemispheres that, when disconnected, can actually think on their own. In addition, we have cross-control and cross-sensation. So the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and takes in and receives information from that other side of the body. Now, again, as I mentioned, there's two hemispheres that I'll talk about in terms of what their primary functions are in a bit. But there's also a pathway between them called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum connects the right and left hemispheres to allow for communication between the hemispheres. And it forms the roof of the lateral and third ventricles, which are these hollow fluid-filled spaces within the brain. Now, if you have damage to the corpus callosum, interesting things happen. It can result in something called the split brain syndrome. I had a friend from college who was a biomedical engineer up at Dartmouth and specialized in split brain syndrome. And what happens is, if someone has really bad epileptic seizures that can't be controlled in any other way, a last resort treatment is severing or damaging the corpus callosum, which somehow seems to reduce the seizure activity. The problem is that without that communication connection between the two hemispheres, they start to form to become more and more independent. And these poor people will be in situations where the right side of the brain likes Red Sox, and the left, I don't mean the baseball team, I mean the type you put on, and the left side of the brain likes Black Sox, and they'll spend the entire morning alternately putting on and taking off black and red socks because they can't communicate enough to decide which color they want. And the same thing with, a light on at night in the hallway. They'll get up and down all night long turning the light on and off because one side of the brain wants it on, the other wants it off. So it's not, as you can see, it isn't that surprising that people could develop multiple personality because our brains are structurally laid out to be two, to be able to, in a way that would allow them to be independent if the communication mechanism between them is severed like it is in split brain patients. It also may allow us to critique ourselves because we are literally of two separate minds. And with the corpus callosum communicating back and forth, we can weigh pros and cons by stepping into the other side of our brain in a sense. So it serves an interesting function. And as your slide says, it's a thick band of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres. Something you might have heard about is right brain people versus left brain people. And on one of your web links, there's a little test where you can take the little test and see if you're more right brain or left brain oriented. Talking about left brain dominance or left hemisphere dominance or right hemisphere dominance, if you're more left hemisphere dominant, you are good with words and language. You have a good verbal memory, very organized, planful, good with rules, but more language oriented, organized, and you like a lot of structure, fixed structure. If you're more right hemisphere dominant, you are very good at spatial perception tasks. Music is something that comes to you easily. And you're good at recognizing faces and tapping into emotional expression, though you may not be able to talk about it terribly well. You may have a good sense of direction and good estimation of distances and being able to recognize and manipulate shapes well. So it's much more visual spatial perception oriented and less concerned with order and structure and neatness and tidiness.